All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our DSpace ORCID update for spring 2025. This session is brought to you today by the ORCID US Community at Lyrasis, the ORCID-CA community at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, CRKN, For Science, and also the ORCID organization. So I'm Sheila Rabin. I'm the Senior Strategist for Research Infrastructure Programs at Lyrasis. So I manage our ORCID US community in partnership with some of our other staff. On the call today, we also have John Aspler, the manager for the Canadian Persistent Identifier community at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, or CRKN. We also have Lambe Timbo, Grant Program Officer and Engagement Lead at ORCID. And we also have Andrea Bolini, Chief Operating Officer at For Science. So today we're going to cover a very brief intro to ORCID and DSpace just to make sure everyone is on the same page with the topics we're going to be speaking about today. Then we'll cover a little bit of a backstory about the relationship between DSpace and ORCID. We'll talk about the ORCID Global Participation Fund program, and then we'll get into the ORCID improvements that we've been able to implement in DSpace thanks to a grant from the ORCID Global Participation Fund. So we'll talk about the ORCID functionality in DSpace overall, and we'll highlight the areas where improvements have been made. And then we'll talk about potential next steps or opportunities for further improvement. And we should have some time for question and discussions at the end. So please do feel free to put questions and comments in the chat as we go along. All right, so let's get right into it. Just a quick overview of ORCID, just as a refresher, or if you're new to ORCID. ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And the ORCID organization is a nonprofit organization that operates around the globe. They provide essentially 3 connected services for researchers and research organizations all over the world. The first is an ORCID ID. That's a unique persistent identifier for researchers that is free of charge to researchers. And that ORCID ID is linked to an ORCID record, which can contain information about researchers similar to what you would see on a CV or a resume, for example. So employment information, works, that kind of thing. And ORCID also provides an application programming interface, or API, that allows software systems like DSpace to communicate with ORCID, pull data out of ORCID records, write data to ORCID records, and get researchers authenticated ORCID IDs. And DSpace, the DSpace community, DSpace is a community-led open source repository software platform that's used by over 3,000 repositories across the globe. This map was the closest I could get to showing a general depiction of how DSpace is being used all over the world, but this is just one page of 34 pages total that show all of the organizations or all of the DSpace instances that are being used. Okay, so with that, let's get into the backstory. I'm going to hand it over to John to take us through a little bit of a history.
Thank you very much. So I just want to preface this by saying that this is from the perspective of the Canadian Persistent Identifier community. So there is a DSpace community narrative here that I'm likely not fully capturing. I suspect folks like Andrea at For Science will have more nuance to add to the story I want to tell here. But I think it's important from the perspective of understanding what it means, at least in a Canadian context, to care about the ORCID integration in DSpace, what it means to focus on it and try to implement it, and the various ways in which the Canadian community, especially in partnership and in many ways led by the American ORCID community, how we've been able to move this forward. Next slide, please. So the most commonly used institutional repository in Canada is DSpace, point final. It is widely used by university libraries across the country. And importantly, relatively recently, Scholars Portal, which is an Ontario-based not-for-profit organization in Canada, has launched a national service called Lyrasis, which is essentially a way of centrally hosting DSpace for Canadian university libraries. So already DSpace was the most widely used repository platform, but on top of that, we're getting institutions in Canada moving and migrating toward a DSpace service. So from the beginning, when it came to thinking about an ORCID integration in the kinds of systems that Canadian universities use, and since most Canadian ORCID members or members of the ORCID Canada community are driven by the library at any given university, we've really focused a lot on the library systems. And that means your publishing platforms like OJS, that means your institutional repositories like DSpace, and that means your data repositories like Dataverse. And each of those systems and platforms has their own communities and practices and histories. So I am excited to focus specifically on DSpace today. Next bullet point, please. So from my perspective, based on the understanding that I have coming into this in 2019, originally there was no integration, meaningful, sophisticated, user-driven, authentication-driven integration in DSpace with ORCID. There was, however, a patch that was developed that was a lookup tool that involved no authentication at all. What it meant was that identity in DSpace at the time was managed through authority files, and you could use this ORCID lookup tool to find an ORCID ID in, like, using ORCID's public API. You would start to search for names, and it would pop up real ORCID IDs belonging to real people, and you could click on it, and it would take that ORCID ID and ingest it into DSpace and attach it to an authority file of an individual scholar. This was a really helpful step in the right direction, but it still replicated the real challenge of identifying the correct person. Because, of course, ORCID only disambiguates scholars if you know which ORCID ID points to which person. And if you are a librarian or a cataloger, someone who top down is searching for John Smith or Anne-Marie Tremblay through the ORCID lookup tool in DSpace, what you're going to be finding there is a very long list of John Smiths and Anne-Marie Tremblays that may not be pointing to the right person, and you may not have the right ORCID ID. So it just replicated the disambiguation problem without resolving it. The way to solve it is to have authenticated ways that a user can interact with the system and say, this is me and this is really my ORCID ID. So they are saying that this is actually their record of scholarly activity. That was not possible previously. It was not possible until DSpace 7.3, I believe, in the summer of 2022. So between 2019 and 2022, and of course earlier than that, there was just this lookup tool. An important part of the story is that this lookup tool, this patch, was only available for a small subset of versions of DSpace. Again, I could not point to the specifics of it. It might have just been DSpace 6.x and on. There were previously two different DSpace interfaces, the JISP UI and the XML UI. They've now been either smashed together, or the different versions have been done away with. I'm not sure the exact language of it. There's only one version now. But all that to say, the lookup tool was only available for one of the two interfaces and was only available for some small subset of different versions of DSpace. So a group of Canadian research libraries got together and they ultimately hired Science to expand access to this specific lookup tool. That meant expanding it to the two versions of the interface, and I believe it went as far back as 4.x, although, again, I might be wrong about that. It might have just been 5.x. The goal was to make it as accessible and usable as possible for as many institutions using DSpace repository as possible. Next bullet point, please. So it's safe to say that my involvement in focusing on DSpace in ORCID in DSpace, and the Canadian involvement has been there for as long as I've been in this role, since 2019. And of course, this is not just a Canadian thing. This is an international thing with many different contributors from around the world. And really the next step here is that after this expansion, Science ultimately built, or perhaps backported from DSpace Chris, an ORCID member API integration, a full sophisticated integration with user authentication in DSpace 7.3. So we went from only having these unauthenticated, top-down authority record lookup tools available to anyone to a full member API ORCID integration. Happy to address what that nuance means if someone's not clear on that. But I really want to highlight that this was a really important step in the development and into implementation of ORCID in DSpace. At the time that this integration was launched, it was certified by ORCID under what is now their legacy certification process. So ORCID has a program called the Service Provider Certification Program. Many different platforms and systems have been certified by ORCID as basically saying that this particular system meets all of the basic criteria or most of the basic criteria required of a system integrating with ORCID. So an institution doesn't even have to go through a process of doing a demo to show that they are correctly using it. They can just plug and play. They can ask ORCID for API credentials and they can just plug the member API keys into this integration if it is certified. At the time of the launch of DSpace 7.3 and the original version of this API integration in DSpace, it was certified. However, ORCID significantly updated their certification process over the next couple of years, moving from a baseline certification requirements, a minimum set of requirements to make a minimum viable product in any kind of system, to a workflow-focused kind of certification process. So publication platforms are going to work with ORCID differently than repositories than other kinds of systems. And so ORCID then shifted to suggesting and requiring different things of different kinds of systems. And unfortunately, although DSpace had been certified at the time, under the, sorry, I seem to have zoomed in my camera a bit there. Although DSpace was certified at the time, its ORCID integration was no longer certified under the updated certification process that had a very specific workflow for repository systems. And the need to have this certified is part of what's ultimately driven the work that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. And I guess I should say next bullet, but yeah, thank you. So although the integration became available as of June 2022, in speaking with many members of the ORCID Canada community, we identified some pain and feature challenges that were causing members to not be able to implement the ORCID integration. Indeed, I think we've only just had our first implementation this year. And so there were a number of challenges that were posed by, and I shouldn't say just the ORCID integration. Some of this has to do with the way that DSpace 7 introduced entities. I'm not going to be talking about that in detail. I think you'll hear more about that from others, but I do just want to say that the ORCID integration itself was, of course, a new learning curve, but it was a tool built on top of a brand new way of using DSpace repository, a way that is very commonly used in DSpace Chris. It's core to how that works, but was new to the repository platform as of DSpace 7. And that was part of what was causing some of the challenges and pain here, as well as the fact that this tool the integration does not interact with the lookup tool and all kinds of little challenges like that. Next bullet point. Thank you. So in having many members come to me and say, hey, we want to do this, but we're running into some challenges, I reached out to Sheila, as I often do when I run into issues with ORCID in commonly used systems. And I asked if anyone in the States was running into this problem. And we started to find that other consortia around the world, like the consortium in Ireland, the ORCID consortium in Ireland, and the ORCID consortium in South Africa, were running into similar challenges. So we started talking together. And of course, it helps that Lyrasis is the documentary home of DSpace. And there was some way to sort of try to better understand the situation centrally and try to collate together the pain, the challenges, the feature improvements that might be needed in order to move forward the integration in DSpace so that our communities could really start using this tool. This is a point that I often make when talking about open source systems, but it often takes a significant amount of international collaboration for the greater good to move forward tools like an ORCID integration in a system or platform like DSpace. It's something that we did previously with the Open Journal system platform, OJS, by working with the Public Knowledge Project to move forward the ORCID integration in that. And it's something that for the DSpace community, while we were not involved in For Science developing the integration, this is all stuff that happened from inside the DSpace community that I know I personally was not involved in at all. When it comes to thinking about ways that PIDs are connected, persistent identifiers are connected to open source platforms, we know that the work that we can potentially do here in Canada or the US could be of significant benefit to the global community. And I'll come back to that point in just a moment, because that is, of course, centrally how we got funding to improve a variety of features in Canada. So what I'll just say is that to sort of end this narrative is that in working together with folks and under the leadership of Lyrasis, with Sheila really moving forward this work, we really wanted to identify and address these potential pain points for our members, but also get the ORCID integration in DSpace recertified with a number of updates. And these are things that Sheila and Andrea will be speaking about in their section. So I'll leave it at that. And really where I'll leave you here with this story is just to say that we didn't know how to move this forward. It was a challenge to identify who could develop fixes, who could work with GitHub tickets. We had some people, volunteers, around the world who might be interested, but we had no way to actually prioritize this work. And that is where something like the ORCID Global Participation Fund, the GPF, came in. It can and ultimately did help us fund and move forward this project that is of benefit not just to our local communities, but the global community of DSpace repository users. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lumbe to speak more to the ORCID GPF.
Thanks, John. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to break this down a little bit. John has already laid such a great foundation, but basically ORCID's Global Participation Program is a two-pronged approach to basically increasing ORCID adoption in the Global South. And this is really low and lower middle income countries as defined by the World Bank standards. So one prong of the GPP is the Membership Equity Program. And the other one is the Global Participation Fund, which I'm going to focus on quite a bit in this presentation. Next slide, please. So we have two distinct grant programs under the Global Participation Fund. And the first one is the Community Development and Outreach Grants. And these ones basically are to fund local partners to build ORCID communities of practice in the Global South. While on the other hand, we have the Technical Integration Grants, which is where this particular project falls. And these are to fund development of systems that are likely to drive participation in the Global South. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a bit more about the community development and outreach grants is that these grants are really about helping people come together around ORCID and make sure that they have the support that they need to use it effectively. And so the focus is to build communities by working with local partners, ultimately increasing ORCID's communities of practice, and also support communities through outreach, training, as well as technical help to grow ORCID use, and also develop strong local consortia. On the other hand, we have the technical integration grants, and these grants really help us to make sure that the systems that are used in the focus communities are working well with ORCID. And so the focus is one, to build integrations by improving or adding ORCID features to widely used open source systems, just like John mentioned earlier. Also to build utilities by creating tools or components that make it easier for people to use ORCID. And lastly, support use by developing clear documentation as well as outreach that can then help us to understand and apply these tools in the community. Next slide, please. So the structure of the program supports a diversity of grantees in order to spread the risk as well as to increase the chance of positive outcomes. So in each grant, every year we have 2 grant cycles since 2022. And in each grant cycle, we give out about 5 grants. And each funding award is between $5,000 and $20,000 US. And also just a note, I did mention the focus communities, but it's also just important to note that, like in the case of Lyrasis, they don't, the organization that is applying for this funding doesn't have to be based in the focus community. But what's important is that the benefits of this project are felt in the Global South, so in the low income countries or the lower income countries. And also in terms of grantee benefits, there are additional benefits such as dedicated ORCID staff contact, also invitations to grantee community events, ORCID's virtual and in-person events, inclusion in ORCID's ongoing communications program, and also invitation to participate in the ORCID grantee forum and community. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a very important aspect of why this grant, this project received this grant. And so what is used to evaluate these different amazing projects that come in is that we have a rubric that we use, and we have established 7 evaluation criteria in order to determine which grantees are most likely to have the largest impact on the fund objectives. And I won't go into detail, but this is on our website. But basically, we have we need to look at whether this project benefits the fund's target communities. So, who are the beneficiaries of this of the project? Who's going to feel the impact of whatever is going to come out of it? Does the project support local partners? Is there program completeness and justification? Is there feasibility of the project? Also, is it in relation to the organization's mission or goals? What exactly is, in what way does it align with the goals or the vision of the organization? We also look at the use of resources as well as sustainability of the project. What happens after the funding is done? So basically, we use these specific criteria just to rate the project. And basically, this project that was submitted by Lyrasis scored very highly in all these 7 criteria. And this is the reason why they successfully received this grant. And you can read more about this on our website. It's all under the Global Participation Fund. And we also have information on other grantees that have received the funding. So that's all from me. I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you, Lambe. Okay, so with that kind of history and an understanding of the ORCID Global Participation Fund, let's dive into the heart of what we're here to talk about, which is the DSpace or ORCID improvements in DSpace that were funded through this grant that we received from the ORCID Global Participation Fund. I do want to mention quickly, I meant to say this at the beginning, but there is a link in the chat to an agenda notes document, and there's some documentation and links there for those that would like to kind of follow along and explore more as I'm going through this content. So our goals for this project were to ensure that the ORCID integration in DSpace was following ORCID's best practices for repositories, making sure that the ORCID functionality was working as expected, trying to make it as easy as possible for researchers and organizations to use the ORCID functionality in DSpace. And we really wanted to make sure that DSpace would be able to meet all of the requirements to become a certified ORCID service provider, as John was speaking about earlier. Our overarching goal with this was to really just try to get more usage of ORCID in DSpace worldwide and increased interoperability through persistent identifiers in general. So we had basically 5 project activities scoped when we applied for the grant funding, and then Forest Science donated an additional activity. But instead of going through these, because it might be a little confusing because they're a little disjointed, what I'm going to do to take us through this today is walk through the actual ORCID functionality that's available in DSpace, starting with 7.3, 8, and 9, etc. So the first aspect is users being able to log into DSpace using their ORCID credentials. So there's an option to log in with ORCID, and when a user clicks that, they'll be prompted to go through the ORCID authentication process. So the user signs into their ORCID account. They see an authorization screen where they're basically authorizing DSpace to get their ORCID ID and get access to their ORCID record. And when the user clicks this authorize button, the user's ORCID ID and a unique access token for that user are sent to DSpace. One thing to note, though, is that DSpace requires an email address for the user upon login. And so previously, if a user was using ORCID to log in, the system would try to grab the user's email address from their ORCID account. And that was creating some errors because the default setting for email addresses in ORCID is private. And so DSpace was unable to grab most users' email address from ORCID. So this little red icon means that my email address is private within my ORCID record. Another potential issue with this is that if the user already had a DSpace account and they were trying to log in using ORCID, and let's say their ORCID email address was public, if that email address was different from the existing email address they already had for DSpace, it could create a duplication of user profiles. And so this was one of the first areas that we wanted to address with this project. So thanks to ForScience, who did all of the development work for this project, we now have a solution. So if a user tries to log in using ORCID and their ORCID email address is set to private, we get this screen where the user can actually just type in their email address, or they can connect to an existing user if they already have an account with an existing email address attached to it. And there are some additional screens related to this. We have a full documentation, and Andrea will talk more about that in a little bit. So once you're logged into DSpace, users, whether they logged in with ORCID or not, can connect their ORCID ID to their DSpace user profile. So you would click on Profile. If you don't have one, you would create a new one and then View. And when you're viewing your profile, there's a little ORCID ID icon in the top right corner. So if clicking on that brings the user to an ORCID authorization screen. And this is your ORCID authorizations page that tells the user what they can do with ORCID. The user can select, because it's possible to sync data between DSpace and ORCID, the user can actually push information from DSpace to their ORCID record. And so they can select whether they want that to happen automatically in a batch functionality, or if they want to handle that manually. And then down at the bottom of that page, the user can also select their preferences. So do they want their publications added to their ORCID record? It's also possible to add funding information if that's available in DSpace, and also profile information. Previously, there was a bug on this page that was giving false error messages, and that's one of the things that was fixed with this project as well. So this page should be working as expected now. Here's an example of quote unquote biographical information pushed from DSpace to ORCID. It's just the link to my DSpace profile is now on my ORCID record, and you can see the source of that is the DSpace demo site, but it would show up as whatever the name of the repository is. And so I mentioned that publications and funding can be pushed from DSpace to somebody's ORCID record. We also have support for pushing patents and products or data sets to ORCID. That is available for anyone who wants it. Andrea will talk more about that a little bit later. There were also some previous issues with versioning. So if updates had been made to a work, the way that was pushed to ORCID as kind of an updated version was not working as expected previously. So that was another area that was fixed. So all of the functionality for writing information from DSpace to ORCID, all of the issues that we were aware of have been resolved through this project. And it's also possible to import works from somebody's ORCID record to DSpace, so like a record of the work. So for that, you would go to My DSpace, click the icon to import from an external source, and then you input the ORCID ID that you're looking for, select ORCID and search, and then you would be able to select a list of results that are listed as works in the person's ORCID record to import those. And it does pull in some initial metadata from the ORCID record, but the user still needs to complete the submission form. But that's another area of ORCID functionality within DSpace. And then something that wasn't happening before, but it's a best practice and it's a requirement for ORCID Certified Service Provider program, is that ORCID IDs should be displayed next to author names on work landing pages in the repository. So here you can see we've got a work landing page, we've got authors, but there's no ORCID IDs showing up here, at least out of the box. I know that some organizations have done some custom work to have ORCID IDs show up there, but that was not occurring automatically. So that was another area that we addressed with this project. So now, and this is for ORCID IDs that are associated with person entities in ORCID. If it's an authenticated ORCID ID, meaning the person logged in and connected their ORCID ID, you'll see the green ORCID ID icon next to the person's name with their ORCID ID upon hovering. If it's an unauthenticated ORCID ID, we are following ORCID's best practices of indicating that it's not authenticated. So that means it was just added to that person's profile without them actually logging in and authenticating it. That will be a gray ID icon with unconfirmed in parentheses by the ORCID number. And then last but not least, there's always been an option or a button on the ORCID authorizations page to disconnect your ORCID ID from your DSpace user profile. Previously, if a user were to click that button, the ORCID ID would be removed from DSpace, but their access token was not actually revoked. And that's another one of ORCID's best practices is if a user wants to disconnect their ORCID ID from their profile, their access token that was granted upon connection or authentication would need to be revoked. And so that was another thing that we fixed during this project. That access token is now revoked if a user clicks disconnect from ORCID. So I'll hand it over to Andrea to take us through a little bit more information about the code and documentation for this work.
Thank you, Sheila. I want to thank ORCID to give us this opportunity to work for the benefit of the community through Lyrasis that chose For Science as trusted technical partner for this implementation. In For Science, we work with ORCID since the very beginning. We worked with API version 1, version 1.1, with .2, and we were the first to implement a bidirectional integration between DSpace CRIS, specific flavor, or DSpace, and ORCID. Starting from the experience that we made and the functionality that were already implemented in DSpace CRIS, we take the opportunity of this fund to donate to the DSpace community a large set of functionality that partially were already available in DSpace CRIS and has been further improved with this project. So all the features that has been shown by Sheila are related to DSpace and are available out of box in DSpace 9, the latest release of DSpace. But all these improvements are also publicly available on GitHub and can be applied to DSpace 7 or DSpace 8 release. As said, DSpace 9 include out-of-box almost all the features that has been described so far. There is an exception that is related to the patent and product support that is available via patch. I will give more detail in a while. We also revisited, thanks to an hard work from Sheila, the ORCID integration documentation page that For Science also contributed. The integration documentation is also specifically available for version 7 and version 8. I would recommend to take a look to the ORCID Authority documentation page that is noted on in the scenario document shared as a link in the chat, because we have recently added some information about how to transition from the ORCID lookup with authority framework to the new system used in Science DSpace 7.3. Next slide, please. One of the major improvements donated with this project is the possibility to have a much more sophisticated login flow to log in DSpace using ORCID. This is not limited only to the private email address. So we know that in previous version, private email on the ORCID profile cause issue on the space. But I'm really passionate about a scenario where researchers have different email address in their ORCID profile and their institutional repository, so in DSpace. Before of this development, it was very, very easy and almost automatic to create a duplicate account in DSpace if the researcher attempt to log in via ORCID. And now this work has solved this issue. This new improved login flow is available in DSpace 9 out of box. It has been backported to version 7 and version 8, but it has been not merged into minor version of these releases due to the fact that this new login flow requires some change at the database level that are performed automatically by Flyway if you apply the patch. But due to the rule of the community doesn't allow to make database level modification in a minor release. Next, please. I already mentioned that patent and product support. Product is often used as an alias of the dataset. This support is not available out of box. What I mean, often institutions like to characterize patent and product in a different way than publication. So this because patent and product are very specific in some characteristics in metadata and so on. And you could benefit to use different entities to describe this content in DSpace than just use the publication entity. If you do that and introduce a specific patent and product entity before of this activity, this DSpace item will be not pushed to ORCID. On the ORCID side, there is no difference between publication, patent, and product. All of them are just named ORCID work. So this contribution allows you to push different entities from DSpace to ORCID as ORCID work. I leave the floor to Seila to introduce some next step that we are looking for.
Great, thank you, Andrea. All right, so over the course of this project, we realized that there were actually a few more opportunities for more improvements that could happen with ORCID in DSpace. So we're going to talk about those before we get into the Q&A. The first one I will speak to, and you may have realized this as we've gone through the presentation, but you know, some DSpace repositories don't allow users to log in. Sometimes there's a mediated deposit workflow, so users aren't actually logging in to submit their own works. Also, a lot of works that might be in your repository have co-authors that are outside of your organization, and you might not want those individuals to be logging into your institutional repository, for example. And so as of right now, to get those authenticated ORCID IDs, authors must be able to log in to authenticate themselves with ORCID. And also person entities must be enabled to get those authenticated ORCID IDs. And because not every DSpace repository is set up to allow for that right now, that is an opportunity for improvement here. We do have a GitHub ticket on this issue, and we would, and we're also going to share a link to a brief survey. We want to hear from everyone about what pertains to you so we can find a solution to this. There's already a workflow that some other software systems like OJS, Open Journal System, and Dryad Data Repository are already using that we could potentially implement in DSpace, but of course there needs to be a bigger, broader conversation within the DSpace community. The workflow that's already being used in other systems to get around this issue of authors being able to log in or having co-authors is having basically email addresses for all the authors included upon submission. When a work is published, an automated email is sent to those authors with a unique link in their email, prompting them to click that link in order to connect their ORCID ID with their work in their repository. So you can see an example here, thanks to Dryad Data Repository for this example. But the author would click that link and it would take them to the ORCID authorization page, and they wouldn't have to log into DSpace at all. Basically, the author's ORCID ID and access token would get sent back to DSpace after the author went through that authentication process. And then you could have those authenticated ORCID IDs for other authors or authors that couldn't log into DSpace to connect their ORCID ID. So that's just an idea. We would love to continue working on this further with anyone who's interested. And I'm going to hand it back to Andrea to take us through a few other opportunities.
Yeah, one of the benefits of ORCID is to enable interoperability. So it's crucial to have the ORCID ID exposed in your metadata, not only on the public page on what a human can consume, but also in metadata that are consumed by machine. This means that we should include the ORCID ID in OIPMH or in the DataCite metadata when we mint DOI, for example. In order to be a certified ORCID provider, it is mandatory to include the ORCID ID in the downstream work metadata. And the issue that you found here in the slide is just to gather consensus and interest about express this metadata, the ORCID into metadata. The topic is a bit more complicated than what presented here, because one question that probably came to your mind is, what about unauthenticated ORCID ID? The guideline from ORCID recommend to expose all the information that you have at the maximum level of detail about this information. So you should say if this ORCID ID is authenticated or not authenticated. Unfortunately, this is not always possible, especially if you need to accommodate your metadata in existing standard that doesn't allow you to do that, as it is the case for the majority of the OIPMH metadata format right now and the DataCite metadata schema. But I think that as a community, we need to work together to find the best solution also for that. Next, please. One important thing that is very specific of this space is the consequence of the background that has been introduced. So the history of this space. We have different implementation of the ORCID integration that was used Science version 5 to version 7.3 to just look up in the ORCID registry to find name, to find the ORCID ID. And these information are stored in a separate place than person item. It's named authority framework, the technical functionality that was behind the first integration of DSpace and ORCID. The DSpace community is moving towards the usage of the configurable entities. It's an ongoing conversation in the community, but essentially it's clear that at some point, configurable entity will become a default, will become a crucial feature on top. We want to build additional feature in this space. And this, for instance, is one of the aspects that is different from DSpace CRIS, and this is also the reason why much more integration with ORCID was anticipated in DSpace CRIS before to include it in DSpace. So one question is, we need to know how many users are impacted by the first version of the ORCID integration. If your institution collects a lot of detail about ORCID ID with the first integration, spend a lot of time in checking this metadata, it could be useful, could be needed for you to have a tool to migrate the existing data into the new system. This tool is not available right now. If you have technical staff at your organization, they could be able to extract the data from the previous system and adapt the data to the new system. But this is not trivial, is not automatic, and requires some technical competencies. Next, please. And again, going ahead on the point to have a good synchronization between DSpace and ORCID, we know that researchers need to be involved more and more in interrepository. Many institutions just have librarian to take care of the submission interrepository. This is okay, but we heard that we need to think about different workflow that maybe just an email workflow will involve the researcher in some way. Currently, we found some scenarios that are not managed in the best way between the synchronization from DSpace and ORCID. Specifically, when the researcher aims to be more involved. So if your researcher want to manually check what is synchronized, the system have suboptimal behavior, because sometimes decision made by the researcher need to be redone again if the repository changed something, and this could be painless for the researcher. This issue on GitHub described the different scenario, and again, we really ask you to spend some time to review this issue and tell us how priority or important these issues are for your institution. I think that is your turn.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Yes, so that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. We do ask that everyone please fill out our brief survey. We're hoping that it should take no more than 10 minutes. We're just trying to gather as much information as we can about who is using what features or would be interested in additional improvements or might want to be involved in future discussions about this kind of work. And so filling out that survey will be really, really helpful for us, as well as commenting on the GitHub tickets that we mentioned for these additional opportunities for improvement. And with that, I believe we can start looking at questions. I know we've had a lot come in the chat. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We're going to try to get through as many as we can, but if for some reason we don't get to your question, we will make it a point to, in this notes document that we have linked in the chat, make sure that all of the questions have some sort of answer pointing you in the right direction in some regard. And of course, you can always email. This is the ORCID US Community address, orcidus@lyrasis.org, and we will also help you. Okay, so I don't know, Paloma, if you have any recommendations on where to start with questions that have been coming into the chat. Otherwise, I can scroll through and just go in order.
That's a very good point, Sheila. So I would suggest we pick the very first one that came in. What are the day-to-day implications for researchers of authentication? Like, what happens if we make a deposit on their behalf? do they get a bunch more notification requests to do stuff that they can then forget to do, refuse to do, etc.? I think that's an important one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paloma. I would say that if a researcher is able to authenticate their ORCID ID with their profile in DSpace, the benefit of that for the researcher is that their ORCID ID, their ORCID record, is then able to be connected to their works in the DSpace repository. Those works are able to be sent to that person's ORCID record, so they'll actually show up on the person's ORCID record. And that way, when that person goes to apply for grant funding and they have to share their ORCID ID or any other context where they're sharing their ORCID ID and their ORCID information, other organizations and other individuals that that person works with will be able to see the full picture of that person's contributions and works, including their works that are in the repository. I would say that's probably the biggest implication there, is just solidifying that researchers' online presence, they're making sure all of their works are included in their ORCID record, and that their works in their repository are represented on their ORCID record. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is this integration does not have a co-author email workflow, which is what we would typically want to see if we're talking about like mediating deposits. If someone doesn't have the ability to like authenticate inside your DSpace instance, for example, I'm seeing a lot of questions and comments about users from outside of your institution who wouldn't have institutional access to your repository. That might need some rethinking from a repository perspective, but generally what we would want is an email workflow where someone deposits something on someone's behalf, or whether it's the librarian or one of the authors, and then all the co-authors receive an email saying, hey, would you like to connect this work to your ORCID? And that just isn't possible at the moment. That is functionality that we'd love to see at some point for sure. But that's certainly an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes, I will also say there is a question about do we have to have authentication, or can we still use ORCID lookup? The ORCID lookup tool is still available in addition to the ORCID authentication. ORCID authentication is the best practice because then you're making sure you have the correct ORCID ID for the person, whereas the ORCID lookup tool, as John mentioned earlier, there could be many other people with that same name. You don't necessarily know for sure which ORCID ID is the right one. So while you can use the ORCID lookup tool, it does potentially introduce errors in terms of having the wrong ORCID ID assigned to the wrong person, unless you want to go about it, and do more kind of manual checking to verify. But the ORCID authentication is recommended for just making sure you have the right ORCID ID.
Yeah, if I can, unfortunately, the wording is complicated, making things complicated. So when we talk about ORCID authentication in this context, CELA is just saying authenticated ORCID ID, but is not required to use authentication via ORCID to get authenticated ORCID ID in DSpace. So because I see that in the question also Shibboleth is mentioned. So it's perfectly fine that you use just Shibboleth to allow your internal user to log in the system, but you still can connect the user profile to ORCID using the authentication workflow just to grab ORCID authenticated ORCID ID. So the two stuff can work together. You are not forced to enable the ORCID login if you want to just get authenticated ORCID ID.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I think I remember seeing another question further down in the chat. Is logging in with ORCID the only way to get it? Okay, so that's semi-related. Is logging in with ORCID the only way to get an authenticated ORCID ID, or can somebody log in with a local institutional account and then authenticate their ORCID? The answer is yes. Yes, in that you can log in with ORCID and that authenticates it, or if you don't log in with ORCID, you can authenticate on that ORCID authorizations page as well. So that's just wanted to address that related question.
There is also another interesting question about duplicating record on the ORCID side.
Yeah.
This is partially connected also with the previous discussion about which is the benefit for external researchers to claim their publication in this space. When you push work to ORCID, work are aggregated by their persistent identifier. So if two different systems push to your ORCID profile the same article with the same DOI, you don't see any duplicate on your ORCID record. You will see a group of record where metadata from one of the two providers are shown first. But if you look closely, you get information that there are two systems that provide the same information. And this is really precious because your ORCID profile will show up the sum of the metadata that come from the two systems. And this could be the case for DSpace that provide a link to an open access version beside your publisher that maybe just add to your ORCID profile the link to the paywall article.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrea. Andrea, another question for you. So what if the reverse happened? What if a user imports a record from ORCID when that record was already in the repository?
DSpace has a basic deduplication mechanism. So you will be, if this deduplication mechanism is enabled in your system, you will be informed that the record already exists and you can discard the record if it was imported by mistake. In the issue that I mentioned about synchronization, what we propose is also to improve this import mechanism. Instead of have the librarian, the researcher, to search in ORCID and pick the publication one by one that need to be imported, we imagine to have an automatic system that could inform the researcher upon login of publications that are available in the ORCID profile, but maybe not yet imported in DSpace. A similar mechanism exists in DSpace Chris, for instance, but we should improve it to exclude duplicate, as the question suggests.
Great, thank you. The next question I'm seeing is asking about how would all of this work with mediated deposits that are not made by the user. And if your organization is using mediated deposits, if your authors aren't able to log in and authenticate their ORCID IDs, please do fill out our survey because that's one of the things we want to work on. We would love to be able to work on next is solving that and improving that aspect because I know a lot of repositories use that mediated deposit. Let's see, what else? So the publication sync between DSpace and ORCID seems to be limited to publications for which the researcher is an author or editor, correct? So they have a lot of theses and dissertations in DSpace. Can theses that the researcher was an advisor of be synced with ORCID? If so, are they imported in the ORCID profile with the current role? I believe that, yeah, do you want to go ahead, John?
Yeah, so
we're probably going
like
to say the same thing.
This is not, so there is no publication item that would exist for the person who advised the thesis. The only author on a thesis is the student who wrote it. They are the only person who gets credit for the work. That being said, ORCID did recently, very recently, so recently that it would not have been affected by any of the work done in the publication, in the plugin update here or the integration update for DSpace that exists now and that we're talking about. There is a new category of things called teaching and supervision, and there is something called a supervised student publication. I suspect a thesis could fall under that category, but it's a very, very recent addition to ORCID's work types, like literally in the last 6 months, maybe even just 3 or 4 months. So no system that I know of is using that just yet. So DSpace certainly isn't, but it is important to highlight that, of course, this is the student's work and not the thesis advisor's work. That is why there is now this teaching and supervision category, but it didn't exist before.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm just
I
scrolling
can
through.
add
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
from-
Andrea.
From the technical perspective, you can configure which metadata are used to track the relation between the researcher with an ORCID ID and the work. So by default, you have contributor author, contributor editor, but you could add additional metadata and decide that researchers that are mentioned in this metadata as a relation will be linked to, will see this work pushed to the ORCID profile. But as John said, probably much better to investigate about more specific entity on the ORCID side, like the teaching activity and supervisor activities.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I just realized we are at time. Would love to keep this conversation going. As I mentioned, we will be sharing this recording. We will be sharing out the notes. We will include kind of the chat log to make sure all of the questions at least have some sort of answer or pointing you in the right direction. But I would like to emphasize again, please, if you're interested in continuing these conversations or if you want to make your 2 cents known, please do fill out our survey and comment on those GitHub tickets. You'll be hearing more from me soon. I'll be sending an email out to everyone who registered for this webinar, as well as on the DSpace community and DSpace developers listservs, hopefully with more information for next steps soon. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending time with us today. I hope this was helpful, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks again, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Bye.